Peace, infinite waters diving deep once again. Can I get a hello there? Why I stopped watching the news. No, wait, a better title. 10 reasons you should never watch the news. That will sell more newspapers. Along my journey in becoming the greatest version of myself, it's been about letting go of old routines and patterns when I would just watch TV for hours upon end. Television, telling lies visually. I say it's time to tell your vision. So, the number one reason I stopped watching the news was because I realized that it was just a story. Doesn't mean it was true. You've got a script. It's entertainment. And it liberated me because, yes, there are news stories which hold a lot of truth. There are people doing some fantastic work, even in the alternative research community. But there is also, number two, a lot of misinformation, propaganda. And it's been used for a long time as a tool of mind control. Number three is that a lot of the news is fear-based. They work on your emotions to get you angry. Now, I take 100% responsibility of what I am watching. That's why I love the internet. You can watch whatever you want. And now you can bring more harmony into your life. It's not the media's fault because fear sells, but it doesn't serve us in the long run. Number four, I was wasting a lot of time just sitting down watching the news. Once I stopped, I could do more things. I had more energy, a new lease of life. Number five, I wasn't following my dreams when I was just sitting down watching other people's lives. Many of us, we are living through other people vicariously. Celebrities. We are in admiration of their fame. And you don't realize that you have to become the hero of your own story. So now I am following my dream, becoming my greatest version, helping other people, helping myself, and so much time to do whatever you desire. The media work on your subconscious mind. I made a video how to reprogram your subconscious mind. Through habit and reinforcement, they keep you in perpetual fear. So you get that same story, that nightmare scenario of what could happen. But guess what? It hasn't happened yet. But more so, you get repetition. I remember watching the news and they were saying exactly the same thing. I scream, you scream.
And welcome back to the show. I scream, you scream. You know the rest.
I scream, you scream, you know the rest.
I scream, you scream, you know the rest.
I scream, you scream, you know the rest.
Well, I scream, you scream, you know the rest.
I scream, you scream, well, you know the rest.
I scream, you scream, well, you know the rest.
I scream, you scream, well, you know the rest.
Got it.
I scream, you scream, you know the rest.
I scream, you scream, we all know the rest.
Well, I scream, you scream, you know the rest.
I scream, you scream, well, you know the rest.
I scream, you scream, you know the rest.
I scream, you scream, we all know the rest of it, right? I scream, you scream, well, you know the rest.
I scream, you scream, you know the rest. I scream, you scream, and you know the rest. I scream, you scream, you know the rest. I scream, you scream, well, you know the rest.
Well, I scream, you scream, well, I think you know the rest.
I scream, you scream, you know the rest.
I scream, you scream, and everybody knows the rest.
I scream, you scream, well, you know the rest.
I scream, you scream, you know the rest.
I scream, you scream, and you know the rest.
I scream, you scream, you know the rest.
6. The Hegelian dialectic. In the 19th century, you had the German philosopher Hegel. And Hegel was fascinating. He came up with a thought which was thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. In other words, problem, reaction, solution. And that's what the media help push. So they give you a problem, weapons of mass destruction, you get angry about it, you want to do something right now, so you react. Now they have the solution. What's that? A war in Iraq. Or better yet, no problem, no weapons of mass destruction were ever found. You react. Now they have the solution. So I'm aware of how it all works. Number 7 is that I realize that that's why they call it a TV program, because it's programming you. I'm all about promoting what I love instead of attacking what I hate. But at the same time, you have to become aware. That's what I realized. I say whatever you focus on grows. But at the same time, in the darkness, you become illuminated. Remote control. No, not to your side. You are being controlled remotely. Channeling. You've got different channels. But this goes back to sorcery. What's going on here? I realized that I have to start creating my own program. Create your own television show. I'll film it. Number 8 is I realized that it goes back into mythology. The ancient sorceress, Medea, in Greek mythology. One of her traits was to be very cunning. She had a clever way of manipulation. And that is just the myth, but at the same time, it plays out in our everyday lives because the media is very cunning. They make us believe in what is not true. They can change our perceptions, distort reality, create illusions. So I say you just free yourself. You feel liberated once you know this. Number 9 is that much of the media we see is controlled by a few people. Ownership. Centralized ownership. For instance, you have Time Warner, Disney, who own ABC, Rupert Murdoch, the News Corporation, hundreds of companies under him. So we see that whoever owns the news station controls it. Therefore, they can dictate what is being shown to you. So that means there is always a hidden agenda. Imagine what would happen if the 7 billion people on the planet united. But a lot of the news separates people. So when you see you are an infinite being, you take the responsibility to start creating a new kind of media that is showing how we are all connected. I'm doing it. Are you doing it? You better do it, because if you're not doing it, then you're not connected to me, but you are connected to me. Why? Because I've seen it. You can hear the words coming out of my mouth. I see you. I'm always amazed when people say, "Oh, did you see what happened over there?" And I say, "No, get out of here. I was just thinking the same thing." Because, wait, then you find out both of you just saw the same news story. So there are no coincidences or accidents in the universe. It's all done by design. What happens when you get everybody thinking in the same way? Now you lose your individuality, your critical thinking, your authenticity. I love the alternative media because it makes me think and question reality in a different way. But ultimately, we must remind ourselves that we are cosmic scientists. Science emanates from the Latin scire, which means to know. You have to know thyself. No media, no news story is going to tell you that. Only yourself. But once you start creating your own media, guess what? You can start creating your own agenda to start inspiring people, giving people a different insight, an alternative. Many people are doing that right now on the planet, and it's fantastic as we help to raise the frequency. And lastly, number 10 is that I saw that I was externalizing my power. A lot of us, we are in 24/7 fear. We feel like a victim. I am a co-creator. That means I take back all my power. The media give us a perceived threat. And growing up, that is where we get all our ideas about how the world works. We get it from there. So once I stopped watching the news, I was healthier. I could sleep at night. I wasn't overthinking about problems I could not control thousands of miles away. At the same time, as a psychologist, sometimes I watch the news to see what they're not saying. And just to stay up to date, people have to remind me of what is going on because I'm living in a different world, a different time zone. Where there is no fear, there is only love. There is only expansion. There is only beauty. There is only joy. Yes, we live in a world of contrast where there is a lot of ugliness as well. But at the same time, it's all about harmony. The yin and the yang, the hot and the cold. In essence, it's all about balance. So, I love the time we are living in right now. And just remind yourself, whatever you see in front of you helps to shape your reality. We are here, infinite waters, diving deep once again. Stay well, stay healthy. Peace.